of all, I would like to express my gratitude for your inviting me this evening in Mumbai. It's my first time to participate in something quite like this heritage foundation you've established, Hockey, which I very much applaud. And I must say, I look forward to returning to Mumbai myself in person one day and participating in one of your tours. We will definitely do this after COVID. So let me share my screen and get this started up here. Right. Okay. One of the most durable fallacies in the study of the Deccan Plateau is this idea that between the 14th and the 18th century, the Deccan Plateau was split in half culturally by a predominantly Muslim north and a predominantly Hindu south. This idea, which was really established or became popular after the publication of a very important book by Robert Sewell, the first study of Vijayanagara, published in 1900, A Forgotten Empire. This book is essentially a translation of two Portuguese histories or chronicles of Vijayanagara, and it was really the first time that the public was made aware of the extraordinary history of this southern empire. And one of the things that Sewell says in his book, in the very first chapter, is that he characterizes the Deccan Plateau, the southern half of the Deccan Plateau, as to say, south of the Krishna River. Let's put the Krishna River here. He characterized the area south of the Krishna River as a Hindu bulwark against Mohammedan conquest. So from the very beginning, in the year 1900, you have this idea of Vijayanagara as existing as a primarily Hindu state, which is stopping or halting the advance of Muslim conquerors from the north. And this idea has persisted really through the entire 20th century, and indeed even down to today. And but what I want to suggest in this talk this evening is that a great deal of research has thrown that characterization into doubt. This idea of a Deccan Plateau split between a north and the south. What I want to argue this evening is that what we really find is a common indigenous culture that characterized both halves of the Deccan Plateau, as well as a common transregional culture, which is to say, peoples on both sides of the Krishna River not only look back in time to the same past and use that same past for their present day purposes, but also on both sides of the Krishna River, these people looked outward to a common Persianate world, which at that time was considered a transregional, a very prestigious culture, which was incorporated into the state systems on both sides of the river. So I want to start by the first half of this argument, which is to say that peoples on both sides of the river were looking back to glorious empires of the past, in particular the Chalukya Empire, which ruled between the 10th century and the 12th century. As you see on the map, it sprawled across pretty much the entire plateau, extending from the Arabian Sea across to the Bay of Bengal, from the Narmada River in the north, all the way down to the borders of the Chola Empire, which of course was their deadly enemies in the Tamil country. And this empire achieved an extraordinary degree of of prestige was looked back upon as kind of the acme, the high point of high culture by subsequent rulers across the Deccan Plateau. And one of my arguments this evening is that it was this empire that was emulated and imitated and glorified by states, whether they were sultanates in the north or Bijapur in the south. They all look back at this empire. And the way they did this is fascinating. And it's not something that was unique to India. Indeed, the idea of using the material evidence of a previous empire in order to glorify one's own empire is something we find pretty much everywhere. In a classic example of this is found in Western Europe, where the founder of the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne, in the year 800 AD, built this royal chapel in his capital in northern Germany, very near the Dutch border today, in Aachen. And what he did when he built this capital was he imported columns from Italy, which had originally been built by the Romans 400 years earlier. So the year now is 800 AD, and he was using material from 400 AD for the simple purpose of identifying himself and his own empire with the Roman Empire. And this notion of using earlier architectural material to kind of boost up one's own claims to imperial status is exactly the same thing that we find happening in the Deccan Plateau. At the height of the empire of Vijayanagara, what we find them doing is reusing Chalukya material in very interesting ways. We know that in the early 16th century, just after the reign of Krishnaraya, the de facto ruler, Ramaraya, who was not the king, but he was ruling as if he were the king, claimed to have an association with the Chalukya Empire. He basically seized power illegally. And in order to kind of burnish his claims to legitimacy, what he did was to surround himself with Chalukya imperial material. He also entitled himself, or gave himself titles such as the Chalukya Emperor, the Chalukya Chakravarti, or the one who captured the city of Kalyana. Kalyana was the capital of the Chalukya Empire in the northern Deccan. He called himself the Radiant King of Kalyana. All these titles were intended to associate Ramaraya, who was ruling in the early 16th century, with the Chalukya Empire, which had already gone out of business in the 12th century. So it's, again, 400 years after the fact. Another spectacular example of how Ramaraya intended to associate himself with the Chalukyas was by removing or dismantling a Chalukya stepped tank. We don't know where the tank was originally built, but every stone was given a number and as a means of identifying where it was located. And then it was dismantled from its original site and then reassembled in the very heart of the Vijayanagara capital in the 1530s or 40s. So this tank you're looking at here was not built by Vijayanagara. It is a Chalukya period temple. We know that for many reasons. The style of writing on the stones and the architecture itself is very clearly that associated with the Chalukyas, not with Vijayanagara. Indeed, even the stones do not come from this area of the plateau. So this idea was not confined to the famous step tank in the capital, but we also find it in the most important temples. Now, what we see here is one of the gateways to the temple of Virupaksha, or Shiva, which was the state temple. It was the oldest temple in Vijayanagara, right on the banks of the Tungabhadra River. And what we find, again, is a reusing of columns in that temple and also in the mandapas close to that temple in exactly the same way that the Emperor Charlemagne in Europe was reusing the columns of the Romans. Now, what you're looking at here is an extraordinary example of Chalukya architecture at its very finest. These columns are associated with a temple in southern in Karnataka. This is the original temple. These are not reused, but this gives you a sample of the very fine craftsmanship. This kind of blue-green schist was very delicately carved by the Chalukyas and is one of the examples of Chalukya culture at its height. And what we find is that these very same kinds of columns were simply reused by Ramaraya in Vijayanagara 400 years after the collapse of the Chalukya Empire. These are magnificent columns, and we see them appearing in Vijayanagara. Here's a half column. You see it sitting on top of this bench, and this kind of column, as I say, was reused in Vijayanagara in many ways. Now, here we see, back in Vijayanagara, this is the mandapa which faces the Virupaksha temple. The mandapa dates to the 15th and early 16th century. And what you have here is on the lower portion, or the ground floor, are reused Chalukya columns. Whereas in the upper floor, the second story, as it were, you have typical Vijayanagara columns made from local stone, local granite. And the contrast is very striking, because clearly what the builders wanted people to see were the columns that were on the ground level, which is where people are walking. And these columns, as you see here in this image, are precisely the same as the kind of column that you just saw in Bagali in the 11th century Chalukya site. So this is one example of how Chalukya material is being recycled, reused for a specific purpose of associating the empire of Vijayanagara with the old Chalukya Empire, in exactly the same way that the Emperor Charlemagne in Europe was importing Roman columns about 500 miles north into northern Germany to associate himself. Now, what's interesting is that the same thing was happening north of the Krishna River. At the same time that the ruler of Vijayanagara, Ramaraya, was using Chalukya columns in his capital, so also the sultans of Bijapur were similarly using Chalukya sculpture and columns in their own capital. For example, in the southern gateway to the city, we have here a recycling of a magnificent example of Chalukya art. This is a Makara Torna, which would have been above a gateway in one of the Chalukya cities. And this same art has been simply recycled and repurposed in the southern gateway to the city of Vijayanagara. I'm sorry, of Bijapur. And the fact that the idea that the rulers of Bijapur, the sultans of Bijapur, admired Chalukya art is very clear, not only from the material evidence, but also from the chronicles of the time. I want to quote to you from an Iranian historian or chronicler who came from southern Iran to India in the 16th century. This is Rufiuddin Shirazi, who in 1575 accompanied his patron, Sultan Ali Adil Shah, down into Karnataka. And when he was in Karnataka, Rufiuddin Shirazi admired the Chalukya period temples that he saw there. And he wrote, and I'm quoting him in translation from Persian, he wrote, "Kings and nobles imitated one another in perfecting architecture and in building many exquisite and grand temples. In later years, many of these have fallen into a state of ruin, but some remain standing, and 400 temples are completely intact, having been built with the utmost of painstaking and elegant workmanship. When we saw them, we were struck with awe." Unquote. So that gives you an example of the degree to which contemporary nobles in Bijapur were impressed by the material remains of the Chalukya Empire. They did not know the history of the Deccan, but they certainly admired these temples. And this gives you some idea as to why it was that the rulers of Bijapur went so far as to incorporate magnificent makaratoranas, such as this one, in their own city gates. This was not confined to simply the city gates, but also the gateway to the citadel of Bijapur. Same thing. We find the Sultan of Bijapur, Ali Adil Shah, in the 1560s, associating his kingdom with the Chalukya period by doing in his capital exactly the same thing that the Ramaraya was doing in Vijayanagara, namely reusing Chalukya period columns, not randomly across the city, but in the most important and most visible part of the city, which is the gateway to the citadel. Any visitor coming to visit the capital would be going through this gateway. And what we find here are something like 24 reused Chalukya columns, which were, you see here in this early photograph. Unfortunately, today, many of them are missing, but this photograph dates back to 1956, when more of them were still intact. And when you go through the present day gateway, you see these columns in the kind of northern Chalukya style, perfectly preserved. And not only were these columns there, but also in the same gateway, they put inscriptions written in an early form of Kannada from the emperors Someshvara II and Vikramaditya VI. These are the most powerful emperors of the Chalukya period, and their own inscriptions were not just preserved, but installed next to these columns so that people would further associate the rulers of Bijapur with the earlier empire of the Chalukyas. So this is one of the ways in which the sultans of Bijapur made this move of identifying themselves with the Chalukyas. Another image of these fine northern style of Chalukya columns we find in Bijapur. So in both the Makara Torana in the lower half, in the city gateway, and also in the grand entranceway to the citadel, we find this evidence of Chalukya material being recycled. This was not confined to the capital, but also is found in the provinces of Bijapur. Here we are in Adoni, a city to the southeast of the capital of Bijapur. You have a typical Bijapur-style mosque, which from the exterior looks like any other typical provincial mosque that you might find in the Bijapur Sultanate countryside. But when we look in the interior, what we find is exactly the same kind of thing that we saw in the case of the mandapa of in Vijayanagara. Again, Chalukya period columns are being recycled, and placed in the most prominent place of the mosque. These are not around the outside or the perimeter. Those columns were simply simple granite columns for the purpose of holding up the walls. But these columns are kind of showpiece columns placed in the middle of the mosque so that people could not miss them. And I want to make the argument that this kind of behavior is exactly the same as we saw in the mandapa of Virupaksha temple in Vijayanagara. A very deliberate choice, it seems to me, is being made here. This use of Chalukya material is not confined to simply moving columns or makaratoranas to new sites, but in some cases, the sultans of Bijapur actually built around existing Chalukya temples. And I want to take us now to Kalyana. Now, Kalyana, as I mentioned before, was the capital of the Chalukya Empire, located very close to Bidar in the central Deccan Plateau. And under Sultan Ibrahim Adil Shah II of Bijapur, a palace was built in Kalyana. And in Kalyana fort, this palace was built right around an existing temple. So here we are in the courtyard of the palace. And if we go through the entranceway directly in front of us, where you see the yellow arrow, we come into a very typical palace room. Nothing unusual about this, very Persian style, pointed arches and so forth. But if we go back into the courtyard and now enter to the left side, through that other opening you see, what we are entering there is exactly a Chalukya period temple, which has been kept intact. The temple has not been moved. To the contrary, the entire palace has been built around this temple by Ibrahim Adil Shah. And it's significant that it was done by Ibrahim Adil Shah, because this is the same sultan who reportedly worshipped the goddess Saraswati in his capital of Bijapur. And so there is this fascinating way in which Chalukya material, in this case, a Chalukya temple, has been directly identified with the sultanate of this ruler. Now, what I've talked about so far are only the ruling class. The ruling class in Vijayanagara and the ruling class in Bijapur. One might want to ask, what about the common people? How did they view the past? How did they relate to the Chalukya period empire? And what's interesting here is we can look at coinage, because everybody uses coinage, not just the elites, but obviously ordinary people, townspeople, villagers have to use coinage to conduct their regular affairs. And what we find across the Deccan Plateau is basically the use of a similar coin, both in the north and in the south. And these coins are based upon an earlier Chalukya coin. Now, what we're looking at here is a golden hone, or it was called pagoda by the Portuguese, of Krishnaraya, early 16th century. But this coin was based on an earlier Chalukya coin, which you see here, dating back to the 10th century or 11th century, which weighed 3.4 grams and had a fineness of 89%. The point is that the coin of Krishnaraya in Vijayanagara, the gold coin, his gold coin, used exactly the same weight and the same degree of fineness in his coins as what we see here of the Chalukya emperors. In other words, this coin weighed exactly the same. And that is very intentional, because clearly the rulers of Vijayanagara wanted to identify themselves again with the Chalukyas, and they did so by imitating their coinage. Now, what's interesting is that, of course, in the northern Deccan, the Bahmani sultans, going back to the 14th century and 15th century, initially minted coins, dinars, and tankas, some of them gold, some of them silver, according to standards that were common in the Delhi Sultanate in the north. But what was actually happening was that already in the reign of the second sultan of the Bahmani period, that is Muhammad I in the 14th century, money changers in the northern Deccan were melting down golden dinars minted by the sultans of the Bahmani sultans and sending this bullion across the Krishna River to the south, where it was then reminted into gold hons. And then those hons were shipped back north across the river and used across the Bahmani Sultanate. This happened throughout the 15th century and the 16th century, not only under the Bahmani sultans, but also under the sultans of Bijapur and Golconda. Indeed, more coinage of Vijayanagara circulated in Bahmani territory than did the Bahmani's own coinage. More than that, more Vijayanagara coinage of the type you see here circulated in the Bahmani kingdom than circulated in Vijayanagara itself. And that seems to me very clear evidence that the memory of the Chalukyas was alive and well, that common people, and not just the elites, preferred to use this type of golden coin. And this was so popular, this kind of coin, that the sultans of Bijapur found it necessary to impose all their own taxes, not in silver tankas or dinars, but in hons, and they used that word. It even got to the point where they had to issue coins that were called hons in exactly the same weight and exactly the same fineness as were used by Vijayanagara and before that by the Chalukyas. So what you see here is a coin of Muhammad Adil Shah in the 17th century, gold coin, imitating exactly the coinage which had already been current across the plateau. This even got to the point where the mosques, some mosques in Hyderabad, insisted that their payments be made to them, their allotments and support from the government would come not in the form of Bijapur coinage, but in golden hons. And they wanted original hons, not these hons that were minted by the Sultan of Bijapur, but the original hons that were minted by the Vijayanagara emperor, including coins with images of Hindu goddesses on them. So all of this shows that the common people were still joined across both sides of the Krishna River by this looking backwards to the same past, the Chalukya past. One other point I'd like to point out here is the architecture of Hyderabad. And here we have a stunning example of how the rulers of the Sultanate of Golconda were looking back not to the Chalukya past, or not only to the Chalukya past, but also to the past of one of the most important successor states of the Chalukyas, namely the Kakatiyas. So here's the Chalukya Empire, and here you see some of the states that followed it. In the south, the Hoysalas across Karnataka, the Yadavas in Maharashtra, and the Kakatiyas in Andhra Pradesh. The Kakatiyas' capital here in Warangal. And what we find is Warangal Fort, which you see here. In the center of this fort was a temple dedicated to the state deity, the deity Shiva, in the form of Swayambhu Shiva. And the whole city was made to replicate the Indian conception of the cosmos, the classical conception, where you have a great circular continent divided in 4 quarters, which is surrounded by a series of ring-shaped oceans, with the cosmic mountain of Meru, the dwelling point of Shiva, lying at the very center. So in a sense, the capital of the Kakatiyas, Warangal, was replicating perfectly this ancient Indian conception of space, of royal space, of divine space, where the ruling deity, Shiva, Mount Meru, is represented by this magnificent temple, which was the state temple of the Kakatiyas. And if you look more closely at this temple, you find around them these 4 magnificent toranas, indicating the 4 directions, the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. And to the west of the temple was the palace of the Kakatiya king. And south of the temple was this very humble element, the chobara, indicating the crossroads, the east-west and north-south crossroads in the center of the capital city located. So here we have the basic design of Warangal under the Kakatiyas. And here you have an image of those great toranas, these magnificent toranas. You see 2 of them here. The one in front of you is the torana to the south. In the distance, you see the northern torana. And in the center is where the temple of Swayambhu Shiva was located. Now that temple was totally destroyed by Muhammad bin Tughlaq in the 14th century, when he was campaigning in the south, and when he was defeating the Kakatiya king, exterminating ending the Kakatiya dynasty. He executed the emperor Prataparudra, and he destroyed that temple, but he preserved the 4 toranas. And that's very important because he wanted to preserve the memory of that site. And so this idea of the 4 toranas, the royal palace to the west of this central area, and the cross point of the major crossroads of the city are found not only in Warangal, but is exactly the same idea of city planning that was replicated in Hyderabad. This is in 1591, when Sultan Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah was establishing his own capital to the southeast of Golconda in Hyderabad, old Hyderabad. And what's interesting is that art historians have typically described Hyderabad as a classic Islamic city. And what I and my co-author, Philip Wagner, discovered was, in fact, no. Sultan Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah was not imitating any a notion of an Islamic city. What he was really doing was imitating or following the same city design that was established by the Kakatiya rulers. And this is seen in many ways. I should say that the memory of the Kakatiyas was preserved both by the Nayakas, the warrior classes of the old Kakatiya kingdom. They were employed by the sultans of Golconda, as well as the Brahmins, the Nyogi Brahmins, who served as clerks, as accountants, as advisors to the sultan. All of them obviously remembered the Kakatiya period, looked back to the Kakatiya period with great pride. As many of you know, in Hyderabad today, you still find toranas all over the place. In the Tank Bund, it crosses the Hossein Sagar in Hyderabad, you find toranas, all of them still looking back to the Kakatiya period. This is exactly what Sultan Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah was doing as well. The parallels between Warangal and Hyderabad are quite striking. In the first place, you have both capital cities were built on a plain exactly 7 kilometers southeast of a former capital. Warangal was built just southeast of the original Kakatiya capital of Hanamkonda, and Hyderabad was built exactly 7 kilometers southeast of the old capital of Golconda. Both cities were laid out on a 4-quartered plan produced by 4 avenues that extended along the cardinal directions from a distinctive structure, namely the Chobara, directly south of the center, or the center of the plaza. Let's see, we'll get to this here. So we have here the Warangal Torana, and then we have in Hyderabad the Chahar Kaman. Exactly the same idea. You have the kamans, the 4 kamans surrounding the center, which is a pool, and then of course in Warangal you have the 4 toranas. To the west, in Warangal, you have this audience hall, which is originally the palace of the Kakatiya Maharaja. After the Muhammad bin Tughlaq conquered the city, he built his own Tughlaq palace on the same site. So what is called the Khosh Mahal was actually the reception hall for the Tughlaqs, built in the same site. Most importantly, the state temples dedicated to Swayambhu Shiva in Kakatiya times, located in the very heart of this plaza, was reflected or finds its analog in Hyderabad by the Gozar House, or this octagonal pool and fountain, which you see here in the early 20th century, and this is what it looks like today. So we have all of these examples of an imitation, but what is most striking and most interesting, perhaps, is the way in which that Chobara was replicated in Hyderabad. In Warangal Fort, you have a very humble structure south of the central plaza, this Chobara, which indicates the center of the city, the crossroads center. It's simply a 2-story open pillared hallway with classical Kakatiya columns. But in Hyderabad, what Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah did was something much more spectacular and elaborate. Namely, he built not a humble structure, but rather the famous Charminar as his central point. And the Charminar, of course, as we all know, is one of the most iconic monuments of the entire Deccan Plateau, if not the most iconic monument there. This has as we know, these spacious arches, a domed chamber on the top, 2 upper stories, a mezzanine, 4 lofty minarets you have, and a richly decorated mosque on the very top of it. And on the apex of that mosque is a solar lotus, or Padma, the iconic Indian symbol of life and energy, with 12 smaller lotuses placed around it in the manner of a zodiac. So the city of Hyderabad, then, it seems to my colleague and I, it needs to be radically reconsidered in terms of what it was doing. What it was really doing was looking backwards in time. And we see that in the way in which the planning of the city was established, exactly replicating the old Kakatiya capital of Warangal. Now, at the same time that rulers in the northern Deccan and the southern Deccan were looking back toward the Chalukyas or to the Kakatiyas, they were also looking outwards in space. They were trying to identify themselves with what in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century was the most cosmopolitan culture known to them, which was the culture of the Persianate world. And this is another striking way in which the entire plateau was unified. Peoples on both the north and the south were looking outward in space. This trans-regional Persianate culture, which extended all the way from the Balkans to the Arakan coast of Burma, across the Anatolian plateau, the Iranian plateau, Central Asia, and most of the subcontinent of India as well. And this culture was informed by the circulation of literature, Persian texts, which modeled ideas of proper comportment, of kingship, of cuisine, of architecture, of music, and so forth. Clothing, what have you. All that was circulating across this area for a number of centuries, and was understood as kind of a secular, trans-regional culture to which all sorts of peoples aspired. And of course, this was not the first one. Long before the Persianate world was established, there was an earlier Sanskrit world, or Sanskrit cosmopolis, in the words of Sheldon Pollock in his important book, The Language of the Gods in the World of Men, where he described this idea of a Sanskrit world which extended from Kandahar in the northwest in Afghanistan all the way across South Asia and Southeast Asia as far as Singapore and beyond. I choose Singapore and Kandahar because both of these, of course, are Sanskrit words. And we find in place names the evidence of this earlier vision or model of high culture with the circulation of Sanskrit texts, which moved across South Asia, the Bay of Bengal, all the way into Southeast Asia in the same way that Persian texts had done later on. And what's interesting is that India is the area where these two trans-regional worlds met and overlapped. And it is the interaction between the Sanskrit and the Persian worlds that I find most interesting and most unique about describing India before the modern period. Because what we see happening is, not just in the Deccan Plateau, but across South Asia, is this attempt to identify with both worlds at the same time, but in different ways. This canon of Persian literature, which goes back to the 11th century, consists of epics, of lyrical poetry, mystical poetry, popular stories, discursive treatises, histories, chronicles. An extraordinary range of literature was circulating across this area. And as I said earlier, it informed people about ideas of dress, of cuisine, of courtly rituals, of etiquette, urban layout, and much more. And this idea of culture was not imposed by force or by power, but rather by imitation. People wanted to participate in this trans-regional world in the same way that Western culture, blue jeans, Coca-Cola, this kind of thing, as we all know, moves across borders everywhere in the planet, associated with a kind of a trans-regional prestigious culture or popular culture. And this is exactly what I think we find happening in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Timur, or Tamerlane, was the great warlord who conquered much of the Iranian plateau in the 14th century. Until his death in 1405, he had conquered an extraordinary range of territory, extending all the way from the Mediterranean Sea in the west, across the Iranian plateau, into northwestern India. He, of course, famously sacked Delhi in the year 1398-99. But he was remembered not only for sacking the city of Delhi, but also because of his lavish patronage of Persian culture, and especially Persianate architecture. We find this imitation happening even after he left India. In this case, even before he left. No, sorry. In the century following Timur, rulers of the Deccan Plateau were imitating the style and culture of Timur by building such things as this madrasa Mahmud Gawan in the city, in the capital of the Bahmanis, in Bidar. You find striking style of domes, of arches, of tile work in the citadel of Bidar, or the famous Rangi Mahal, where you have woodwork and tile work imitating the style of Tamerlane, Persianate culture. The colored tiles that are associated with Timur were also replicated here in Bidar. So that's very, very obvious, it seems to me. But in more subtle ways, the Persianate ideal of justice was emulated and imitated across the Deccan Plateau. We have already in the 13th century, Sultan Iltutmish, the Delhi Sultanate, simply putting one word on his coins, adl, which means justice, which I think speaks for itself. This idea of justice as being the root basis of Persianate governance. Or again, moving into the Mughal period, Shah Jahan places this image of the scales in the entranceway to the Hall of Justice in Shah Jahanabad, again pointing to the significance of the idea of justice as being the basis of government. It's not God, it's not religion, but rather the idea of justice, which is central. Now, this idea is something that was propounded very early in Persianate literature. Here we have, for example, a page from the Farsnama by Ibn Balkhi, written in the Iranian plateau in the 12th century, under the patronage of the Seljuk Turks. He writes, "There is no kingdom without an army, no army without wealth, no wealth without material prosperity, and no material prosperity without justice." Now, this formula these kinds of ideas were very popular in the 12th century in a genre of literature called the Nasihatnamas, or the Mirror for Princes, advice literature for kings and how to rule. And what's significant is that this very simple formula combines economics with politics, with morality. And you notice that there's no mention of religion, no mention of God. It is justice, which is the underlying idea which informs this vision of proper rulership. And what's interesting is that this kind of formula, this idea that informed kingship across the Iranian plateau and across North India, is also found in the Kakatiya state. At Warangal, under the patronage of Kakatiya kings, we find this Telugu poet, Badana, in the 12th or early 13th century, formulating almost precisely the same idea that was seen in Ibn Balkhi. To acquire wealth, make the people prosper. To make the people prosper, justice is the means. O Kirti Narayana, they say that justice is the treasury of kings. The similarity between what Badana is writing in the 12th century and what Ibn Balkhi was writing at roughly the same time in the Iranian plateau is simply very striking. And it shows you how the idea of justice and this idea of rulership has moved beyond the Delhi Sultanate into South India long before the Kakatiyas had been conquered by the Sultanate. In other words, these Persian ideas were obviously in circulation. And that, to me, is the important point. And the fact that these ideas could circulate without the force of conquest illustrates this notion of imitation, of emulation. And it's not just confined to the idea of justice, but also the very idea of the sultan. When Indian rulers wanted to associate themselves with the most powerful word available for rulership, they chose the word sultan. The founders of Vijayanagara, Bukka, Harihara, and Marappa, these brothers, all of them used the formula Hindu Raya Suratala, which translates as sultan among Indian kings. And again, they're using the word sultan precisely because this is the word with which they want to associate their idea of kingship. It's the most powerful word of a king in the vocabulary. Of course, they also used Sanskrit words at the same time, maharaja and so forth, together with sultan. These rulers were obviously reaching for any words which would burnish their own claims to supreme power. In this case, they are borrowing from the Persianate world the same idea. Audience halls, going back to architecture, we find in Vijayanagara the use of audience halls in the same way that were found in the Iranian plateau, in North India under the Tughlaqs, or for that matter, under the Bahmanis in the northern Deccan. Here we are in Vijayanagara, the platform to the 100-column hall. The columns are no longer existing, but you see here, indicated by this red square, the area where these columns had been located. And here you can see the foundational points where these columns were originally planted. And a reconstruction of the design of the 100-column palace has been published. You see it here with 10 columns on each of the 4 sides of the palace, meaning you have 9 arches facing the 4 cardinal directions. And this idea of a 100-column palace is exactly the same thing that is found stretching all the way back to ancient Persia. If we go to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire dating to the 6th century BC, here we have the great entranceway to the capital, the stairway going up to the palace, the columns, a few of them still standing from before Alexander the Great destroyed the capital in the 4th century. But most importantly, you have here the Hall of 100 Columns. So this is a diagram of how Persepolis was designed. And we see the Hall of 100 Columns in Persepolis, and we can compare that with the Hall of 100 Columns in Vijayanagara. The similarity is quite obvious. Clearly, the rulers of Vijayanagara had the Persian model in mind when they were constructing their own court. And this was noticed, I might add, by foreign dignitaries. In 1443, an ambassador from the Timurid state named Abdul Razak Samarkandi visited Vijayanagara, and he met the Deva Raya II, and he described this court and described what he called the Chahel Satun, which literally means 40 columns, but it was a trope for the 100 columns that he saw there. So he identified this palace, as something that was familiar to him from the Persianate world. And of course, you also find in Vijayanagara Persian-style domes, arches, and vaulting. The oldest part of Vijayanagara is called the Sacred Center along the southern banks of the Tungabhadra River, where you have the Virupaksha temples and other important temples that were patronized by the emperors, using classic South Indian architecture. But to the south of that is the Royal Center down here, which is very cosmopolitan, open to ambassadors And it is in this part of the city that you have this Persianate style of architecture, such as the so-called elephant stables, where you have the pointed arches, the domes, you have the cross vaulting techniques used here in the archways. All of this, of course, imitating this larger Persianate world that I mentioned. We also find this in the adoption of Persian attire or clothing, both in terms of headgear and in tunics. Here, for example, is a typical miniature painted in Bijapur, showing the Sultan and his courtiers. And to the left, you see this headgear, these tall hats called kula, which is simply a Persian word for headgear or even crown. This is very much the fashion in the day. And in Vijayanagara, we go down here to this, in Raichur, the courtyard of that was conquered by Krishna Raya. He depicts himself seated on a throne with two female courtiers on both sides, and he is wearing a kola. In fact, the word kola was integrated into Kannada and Telugu, kolai, taken from the Persian kola. And again, he is trying to clearly identifying himself with this Persianate world. The same is true with tunics. You see the men on both sides of the horse are wearing these colorful tunics, full all the way down to the knees. And this same kind of clothing is found in Vijayanagara, where the courtiers are wearing both these tunics as well as the tall kolas. This you see here is a wall paintings from the Lapakshi temple, located north of Bangalore, some 100 kilometers north of Bangalore. These paintings, again, point to the extent to which the ruling class in Vijayanagara was imitating the Persianate style, very much the cosmopolitan style of the day. So and one last point is, if we look at the Mahanavani platform, a famous royal site in Vijayanagara, there are all kinds of images around this platform imitating the culture of its own day, including this example of what appears to be a Turkish merchant carrying horses to the king. Horses were imported, of course, from Iran and from the West to Vijayanagara. They formed the basis of the cavalry. And of course, there was a large segment of the population of the army were Turks. Thousands of them were employed by Vijayanagara. So we know this from historical evidence as well as this kind of pictorial evidence, where we see this contact is made with the outside world through commerce, through the steady importation of horses. So what I want to do then today is to simply conclude by arguing, going back to my original point, that both to the north and to the south of the Krishna River, rulers were doing two things. On the one hand, they were looking backwards in time to the Chalukya Empire for inspiration and for imitation. That both the rulers of Vijayanagara and the sultans of Bijapur, and before that, the Bahmani rulers, were imitating the Chalukyas, using their columns, using their toranas, incorporating their palaces around the Chalukya temples, by way of associating themselves with that earlier glorious, prestigious Chalukya Empire, and in coinage as well, of course, the golden hone. At the same time, rulers on both sides of the Deccan Plateau were looking outward to the contemporary Persianate world. And they did that, again, through architecture, through ideas of justice, through dress, through their attire. And in all these ways, or in both of these ways, I would argue the Deccan Plateau was not, in fact, divided between a so-called Hindu south and a Muslim north, but to the contrary, both parts of the plateau were firmly integrated in the sense that they were looking to the same past, the Chalukya past, and they were looking to the same present, which is this Persianate world, this cosmopolitan, prestigious world that had already embraced so much of Central Asia and the Middle East. So with that, I'm going to conclude and would be happy to open the floor for any discussions or any questions that you might have. And I wish to, again, thank you very much for this opportunity to share these ideas with you.
Thank you, Professor. It was really illuminating. You brought in so many ideas about fluidity of cultures across the seas, across rivers. Let me begin by asking you two questions which have come in from the audience. People are surprised to note that the Qutub Shahs wanted to keep the memory of the Kakatiyas alive, and the Islamic Bijapur was trying to incorporate the statutory of the Hindu Chalukyas. What does that say about religion? When we know that iconography, etc., is specifically forbidden in Islam.
What does that say about religion?
Yes.
It says very little about religion. It seems to suggest that these rulers were not interested in religion, they were interested in power. And the Chalukyas were identified with power. I think I mentioned that as you walked into the citadel at Bijapur, the first thing you saw was an inscription of Someshvara II and Vikramaditya VI, who were the most powerful emperors of the Chalukyas. And it seems to me that this association with the Chalukyas was really structured around the prestige of power, as reflected not only in their inscriptions, but also as remembered in their columns. So I don't think religion really had anything to do with this whatsoever. And the same is true in the southern. Clearly, it was a question of the power and the prestige of the Chalukyas that was foremost in their mind.
Arun Gupta makes a statement that Adil Shah was Rama Raya's adopted son. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, adopted son was yes, in a sense, that's true. There was Rama Raya had begun his career in the northern Deccan. He himself was a courtier in the Qutub Shahi Sultanate of Golconda, until he was dismissed, and then he found employment in the south under Krishna Raya, who was his father-in-law. And later on, when Rama Raya becomes the most powerful figure in Vijayanagara, he gives support not only to Ali Adil Shah, but also to Ibrahim Qutub Shah, who fled Golconda due to troubles in the north, and he found refuge in Vijayanagara, lived there for I think something like 6 or 7 years, until he finally came back north and became the Sultan of Golconda. But by that time, he'd become totally Teluguized. He became a great patron of Telugu literature. So yeah, the point is very well taken. There was a tremendous amount of contact between the north and the south, and it was not confined to warfare. But also there was a certain kinship, a fictive kinship between the rulers of Vijayanagara and the sultans of both Golconda and Bijapur.
Varun Pathak says that the images in Lepakshi could be of foreign delegates from the north in the royal capital. Could that also be the case? Why does it have to be that the people in Vijayanagar kingdom were imitating Persian costumes?
Well, yes, that's a very good question. There is no doubt that there were ambassadors who were coming to Vijayanagara from the north. There's frequent contact between them. Indeed, there had to be contact because it is because of that contact that the courtiers of the south adopted this clothing. But it is doubtful, though, that that particular Lapakshi painting is an image of northern ambassadors, for the simple reason that they are all depicted kind of prayerfully giving homage to the Vijayanagara king, indeed the deity at that temple. It is a temple. It's not a court. So one can presume that these are actually Vijayanagara courtiers wearing the kula in the same way that the Krishnaraya himself was doing. But the point is well taken. Clearly, there was a great deal of contact between the north and the south. Otherwise, these ideas could not have appeared in the south. Yeah.
Tushar Shetty says that he has seen carvings of Krishnadeva Raya wearing similar clothes. Question from Madhumati Rastogi. Was there any Indian or Deccan influence on Persian culture, or was it always coming this way?
That's a very good question. I myself have been looking for answers to that. What I can say is that the majority of the influence comes from the Persianate to the to India, and not the other way around. Now, having said that, it is true that one finds some examples of Sanskritic culture penetrating the Persianate world, even as far as the Iranian plateau. We find place names in Afghanistan, which clearly reflect this idea. The notion of Pura, which is Sanskrit for city, is found in places like Nishapur, in the
Iran,
in northeastern Iran, and that gives evidence to a much earlier kind of movement of Sanskrit and even Buddhist influence across the plateau. Obviously, Afghanistan was a transmission point of Sanskrit and Buddhist culture into the Iranian plateau. So yes, this influence was not only one way, but by the 16th and 17th century, the predominance of it was one way. And this is the time when the Persianate world had become extraordinarily prestigious, that everybody was imitating this. And I might add that we also see this reflected in language. There's an extraordinary amount of Persian vocabulary which comes into the Deccan Plateau in this very period of time. It is estimated that in the 16th century, as much as 40% of Marathi was in fact came from Persian words. And the same is true for Telugu and Kannada, and obviously Hindi in North India. So this is all part of the same phenomenon, which is this extraordinary influence of Persianate culture across India.
Dr. Uday Kulkarni wants to know why the Persianate Age ends in 1765. Is it perhaps linked to the Diwani of Bengal?
Thank you. That's a question that it's rather embarrassing for me to have to confess here, that what I've done in the book is pick an arbitrary date. The Persianate world did not end in 1765. It continued into the 19th century, even the 20th century. The Mughal Empire continued to patronize Persian, obviously, all the way down to 1858, when it was extinguished, and even beyond that. When one thinks of poets, obviously Ghalib or even Iqbal in the 20th century were still using Persian. So the Persianate world did not end in 1765. What happened in 1765 was the Diwani of Bengal, and that was a political change. And the political change, obviously, was the advent of the British Raj, but the British themselves patronized Persian culture. all the way down to 1830s, when they officially replaced Persian with English as the language of diplomacy. So the reason I chose 1765 was because the publisher, Penguin Books, said that my book had to be of medieval India, not modern India. And therefore, I had to use a date which is identified with the advent of modern India, and we associate that with the British. And so I must freely confess that the date 1765 is a political date. By no means does that mean that the Persianate world stopped abruptly. It certainly declined, especially with the rise of nationalism in India and with nationalism in Iran. Iran appropriated Persian as an Iranian language. Of course, Indian nationalism has a very different trajectory. So 1765 was simply an arbitrary date which I selected because I had to stop talking about medieval India because there was another book about modern India later on. So thank you for that question.
Speaking of your book, Professor, is it available in India?
Yes, the book is available in India. Persianate India in the Persianate Age. This one here is published by Penguin, but it is available, I'm told, all over India in bookstores. Okay. Penguin does have offices in India, yes.
True. Moving on, Anirudh wants to know about the Madurai Sultanate. Did they try to keep the memory of the Pandyas alive?
Very little is known about that sultanate, the Madurai Sultanate. It only lasted for several decades before it was extinguished. And so I am not aware that there was any deliberate attempt to keep the Pandya memory alive. But I confess that we simply do not know enough about the Madurai Sultanate to make that judgment. I hope that with more research in the architecture, what little architecture remains, somebody might take up that question with a view to answering the extent to which the Madurai Sultanate was, in fact, attempting to model itself on the
Pandyas.
Yeah, very good question.
Tushar wants to know where he can read about contemporary accounts from Western travelers about other Deccan kings like Adil Shah and Shivaji.
Wants to know whether there are other sources about them?
Right, about Adil Shah II and Shivaji in particular.
Well, I'm not aware of any biography of Adil Shah II that is devoted only to him, but he is perhaps the best known of the sultans of Bijapur. There have been a number of histories of Bijapur which do, I think, good jobs of summarizing his kingship. There's been an enormous revival of the study of the Deccan in the last 15 years or so, but to date, we do not have a proper biography of Sultan Ibrahim II. And this, it seems to me, is a shortcoming, and I very much hope that somebody will take up the challenge of writing a proper biography of this sultan, because he is one of the most interesting sultans of the Deccan Plateau, no doubt about it. He's the author of the Kitab-i-Noras, patronized music, patronized extraordinary architecture, not least the palace at Kalyana, which I showed you. But there needs to be a proper biography of him, and I hope that one of you might do that. Shivaji, of course, is a different story. There are many biographies of Shivaji, and I'm sure many more will be written. I only wish that there were more balance, and that when somebody would take up the challenge of writing about the Ibrahim II, an extraordinary sultan. Yeah.
We have somebody in the audience called Rajput who says that could cost also have been a reason for reusing material from the previous empire. And anyway, who wants to associate themselves with a fallen empire?
Well, who wants to associate with a fallen empire? If you go to Washington, D.C. and look around the mall, you will instantly see the Supreme Court building, which is exactly modeled on the Greek Acropolis in Athens. You will see the Washington Monument, which is a huge obelisk modeled on the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. You will see in Paris, France, the Arc de Triomphe, which is modeled exactly on the Roman triumphal gate in the capital of Rome. So I should simply say that there is much evidence, not just in India, but all over the place, all over the world, where subsequent rulers have tried to identify themselves with glorious empires of the past. And in this regard, the rulers of Bijapur and of Golconda and of Vijayanagar were not alone. They were doing something that many rulers do, which is to associate themselves with a powerful and prestigious kingship of the past. Very simple.
And in Bombay, we have our own town hall. Lovely.
Yes,
column.
of course. Absolutely. You have you don't have to leave Bombay. You see, it's right there.
Mazer wants to know where he can catch these stories in pop culture or movies.
Where you can find these stories in pop culture and movies.
Yes.
You mean the stories of Vijayanagara
and the Deccan and the influences and the fluidity of cultures, I guess.
Yes. I'm not aware that pop culture and movies have yet discovered this. But I think it would be a great idea for Bollywood to take up the challenge. I mean, after all, this is what Bollywood does, is to create pop culture. And it seems to me that one way to do this, one fruitful way of doing this, would be to take up the challenge of looking at India's own past and imagining how this might enter the world of pop culture as well. It's a very good idea.
And I'm sure they know where to go to get a historical consultant right here.
Yes, of course.
In you. A bit of a political question. What in the Deccan, were any temples destroyed for material? I mean, I think what Ravi means is the material for construction.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because we don't know. I mean, when you look at a column that's being used in like the mandapa in Vijayanagara or the citadel in Bijapur, both of them have Chalukya columns. We don't know where those columns were originally found. There's no way to exactly determine whether they were from a temple that was recently destroyed or whether it was from a temple that was simply in disuse, had passed out of worship, or had fallen into a ruin. So the problem is we really cannot understand. We don't know in most cases the origin of these columns, or whether a temple was recently destroyed or was simply in disuse. But certainly, a lot of this evidence was lying around. I mean, we temples always are passing out of usage or worship, and we do know, as I quoted Rafiuddin Shirazi, the chronicler, and how he was struck with awe when he encountered Chalukya temples. So there's no doubt that people in the 16th century admired the artwork of these temples. But the short answer is there's no definite way of determining whether a temple was recently destroyed or whether it was simply a much earlier temple that had fallen into disuse and whose material was being reused.
I just want to tell the audience we are running out of time and we have many more questions. We'll try to take in as many more as possible, but we request you to put in any more questions. I can see about 27 of them. We'll just take the last few now.
Yeah.
Professor, more about the Lepakshi paintings. Raj says that he finds them in Punjab temples too in the mid 17th century, blue headgear. Could they have been Egyptian guests?
I'm sorry, he finds them in the Punjab, you said?
In Punjabi temples.
You mean a similar kind of clothing?
Headgear.
Yes.
No, headgear.
Headgear. Yes, that makes total sense to me, because this headgear was very much the style in the 16th and 17th century. Certainly not confined to the Deccan. It was found across India. We find it in Central Asia, and we find it in miniature painting as well. So I did not mean to say that this was confined to only the Deccan Plateau. It's across India. The whole of South Asia was absorbed in this larger Persianate world. So it is not at all surprising that we find this in the Punjab.
Professor, you talked about various dynasties harking back to the Chalukyas. So the question from Shashi is, did the Chalukyas themselves imitate and derive legitimacy from previous empires like the Guptas, the Rashtrakutas, etc.?
Precisely. Thank you for making that point. I did not mean to suggest that the Chalukyas invented everything from whole cloth. Every empire looks to the past and tries to build upon that past in order to burnish and increase its own claims to authority. So yes, I think we can say that there was a definite connection between Chalukya architectural material and earlier empires. Certainly the Badami Chalukyas, after all, from which they were related, and the Badami Chalukyas themselves, according to chronicles, Sanskrit chronicles, were supposed to have come from North India to the south, dating all the way back to the Mauryas. So what we find is a kind of a fraternity of empires across time who are connected vertically, each one looking to the past in order to justify its own claims to rule in the present.
We have somebody in the audience who's bemoaning the increase in nationalism. He's used a word for it, which I don't want to repeat, about fascistic nationalism. But he bemoans the fact that it's happening in the country and he wants people to be more open and loving. Good thought. Ravi remembers Percy Bysshe Shelley. He's remembering Ozymandias, King of Kings. I look upon my work, see mighty and despair. Lots of compliments, Professor. Last few questions, definitely. And maybe if with your permission, we can impose on your time. Maybe?
Yes, please.
Why was Persian the court language of the Turco-Mughal emperors?
I'm sorry, I did not hear that.
Why was Persian the court language of the Turco-Mongol Mughal emperors of India?
Yes, why was Persian the court language?
That's right.
Yes, it was Akbar who in 1582 established Persian as the official court language of the empire. And the reason for that was that by his period, which is the late 16th century, Persian was already recognized as a trans-regional language which was used across Central Asia, across the Iranian plateau, extended deep into all across the Silk Road as far as China. Akbar, by this time, had already incorporated Rajput lineages into the empire. We know this beginning in the 1570s. He was already doing this. And he needed to find one language which would unify the entire empire, which would arch over all the peoples. And it seems to me that the use of Persian was a very logical choice, simply because although Persian was foreign to everybody, I mean, the native language of the Mongols obviously was Turkish, but Persian had this extraordinary prestige associated with empires going all the way back to the ancient Persian Empire itself.
Nikhil
Plus,
has sorry.
actually, one last point. Persian was also a language of administration. That the ancient Persian emperors had perfected a class of professional writers who were concerned with the issues of a language in which revenue was collected and justice was administered. And this was a tradition which was very old in Persian culture and Persian history. So Akbar's choice of Persian made a great deal of sense, not only because it was a language that would encompass all the peoples of the empire, but also because it was a specialized language of administration. And many peoples learned Persian in order to get into the bureaucracy, especially the Kayastas, the Khatris, Brahmins, of course. All of them learned the language in the same way that English was learned by Indians.
Later on, yes.
Very similar thing, yes.
What is your opinion, Professor, on the temple segments used for mosque buildings by the Delhi Sultanate in the Qutub complex in Delhi?
Well, the Qutub complex in Delhi was built very hastily, immediately after the conquest by Aibak. Muhammad of Ghor. And those materials, we know because there's inscription on the Qutub complex, that those particular columns were taken from a number of temples in the area. So in that case, it seems very likely that temples had been destroyed at that time and recycled into that complex. That is one of the few instances where we know that the temple, the materials used in the columns in the Qutub complex were from Hindu and Jain temples in that area. And it was very clearly making a political statement that there was a new ruling class in town, and they wanted to establish that they were replacing an earlier one, which had been resisting the Turkish advance. And that point of resistance is very important because in Delhi, as well as across all of India, the temples that were destroyed were invariably temples that were identified with former rulers that had resisted the new regime. Ordinary temples for ordinary worship by ordinary Hindus were never touched. They were left alone. It was only temples that were associated with earlier rulers, royal temples. I mentioned the temple of Swayambhu Shiva in Warangal, the Kakatiya. Exactly. You notice how it was only that temple that was destroyed. All the other temples were left standing and continued under worship.
Professor, do you subscribe to this theory that the internal squabbles of the southern kingdoms with their various southern neighbors allowed northern Islamic invaders, I am putting them in quotes, the person who's asking this question hasn't, made it easier for them to conquer the Deccan?
Well, could you repeat the question, please?
Is it true that warfare on the southern borders weakened these southern empires and allowed northern Islamic invaders, quote, much easier access to the Deccan?
Yes, I think that's true. I think you're referring to the warfare between the Yadavas and the Kakatiyas and the Hoysalas, the three major successor states to the Chalukyas, who were constantly at war with each other. That's true. It's also true that when the first conqueror of the Deccan, Alauddin Khilji, comes down in the end of the 13th century and invades the Yadava capital of Devagiri, the Maharaja is not even in the city. He is himself campaigning in the south. He had abandoned this capital in order to wage war against the Hoysalas. And so when Alauddin Khilji arrives there, he surprised the rulers of Yadava and was easy to take it. So yes, I agree with that. There's no question mutual warfare between these successive states made it much easier for the Delhi sultans to conquer the south. That's true.
So Shoryendu Ray has a question. How much of the commonality in modern language of this region would you attribute to the theory of their common origins, back when? Or is it more got to do with the cultural exchange under the Persianate Age?
That's a very good question. I think on balance, more of it has to do with cultural exchange in the Persianate Age. What happened in the 15th and 16th century was that India was being integrated into much larger regimes of interregional commerce and exchange. The Chinese, for example, had arrived in the Indian Ocean in the early 15th century. Yeah, the Chinese under the Ming, the early Ming dynasty had reached India in the early 15th century, integrating India into much larger regimes of exchange with the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. It's also true that the Arabian Sea had become a vehicle for interregional commerce. Obviously, Vasco da Gama reaches the Malabar coast in 1498, beginning all of that, the Portuguese era. So what's happening is that the arrival of the Portuguese is really hastening a process of interregional exchange, which was already there. The Portuguese are simply attaching themselves to an existing Arab and Persian pattern of commerce across the Indian Ocean. Indeed, more Portuguese ships, more Portuguese commerce was happening with existing Indian Ocean vessels than with Portuguese vessels. So what I want to argue here is that, yes, this exchange was happening in a massive scale. The Deccan Plateau became a crossroads. And I think the one word I want to leave you with this evening is that word crossroad, because a crossroad in the sense of oceanic maritime trade, and as well as internal exchange and migration within the Deccan Plateau itself. We find pilgrims moving from north to south, Turkish warriors, fighters were being, mercenaries were being hired by sultans of the northern Deccan, as well as the rulers of the south. Deva Raya II of Vijayanagara alone employed 10,000 Turkish fighters in Vijayanagara and set them up in his capital, built mosques for them in that area. So there was an extraordinary degree of exchange happening in the 16th century and 17th century. And I think that's the primary theme that we need to accent for this period. The word crossroad is the fundamental idea that the Deccan really was a world crossroads at this time.
Thank you so much, Professor. There are many, many, many compliments for the talk. I just want to read out one specific one. The person says that you need to be awarded a Padma Bhushan. It is amongst our major civilian awards, Professor. He says that you are more Indian than all of us combined. Most haven't heard of Islamic rulers beyond the Mughals and maybe the Khiljis. So thank you very, very much for spending your time. We are indeed honored and flattered. And we hope to host you again sometime in the future, live.
Thank you.
Thank you and everyone in the audience for being there. And thank you for all the many, many questions which made us extend this talk so much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.